brief history of death. Let's talk about death, and not the physical decaying of the body, morbid, I'm decaying type of death. We're going to talk about the archetype death. The one, the only, the Mr. Grim Reaper. That's what we want to talk about today, and just to go over kind of a brief history of who he is and how he came to be. The Grim Reaper goes by a lot of different names. The Destroyer, the Hooded One, the Angel of Death, the God of Death, if you want to go out there. So, a lot of us historians believe that the modern Grim Reaper was first awarded the name Grim Reaper as early as the 1800s, where the description of the Grim Reaper can really be traced back all the way to the 15th century. Death is usually depicted in two different forms. One is a psychopomp, where basically he is the deliverer of souls, where he just goes and sits, waits for the person to die, and as they die, he transitions the soul from their deathbed to the final resting place. Where the other kind of interpretation of death is he's lingering and causing the death by the touch of death, as a lot of people depict it throughout the centuries, where he's the actual one who decides who lives and who dies. So those are the two distinct variances between the personification of death itself. Now, how far back does this really go, though? Death has always been around, so we personify this from the earliest of times to give us a better understanding of what happens to the person during the death stages. Even before Greeks, the harvest for the many pagan society was during the fall and winter transition, and it was believed to be a time of death and dying because their crops were starting to decay, the trees were starting to die off, the plants were dying off, and you would have to get this harvest in before this winter set in, where everything was about death and decay. So winter was generally an idea and a sample of death and what death would be. You can see from here some of the personifications of death, the coldness, the absence of life, the solitude, comes from some of these ideas of the winter months during the pagan societies. The scythe is a representation of death because of how it was used during the harvest. So you would sit there and you would cut your crops down with a scythe, and you would harvest them, you would bale them, and you would take them and store them for the winter months when you had nothing else to eat. Not a very big stretch of the imagination to configure an idea that this entity, this person of death, would carry a scythe to harvest the grains from you, to take that life essence out of the crops away from you, so that it was marking your village or people in your village for death, because if you do not have enough harvest, you will die. And that is kind of how the scythe got tied into the legend of the Grim Reaper. That's not the only reason we use the scythe, as we'll find out with the actual Greek legend of Kronos. So the Greeks had a word for this entity. It was a psychopomp, meaning the guide of souls. The Charon is a notable example, as he was a Greek entity who carried the souls of the dead across the river to the afterlife. And there's, legends and stories about how you could pay this psychopomp, the Charon, to travel to the afterlife to communicate with the dead souls. And that's actually one of the early Greek metaphors for the Grim Reaper is Charon. But that's not the only thing the Greeks had to contribute to the legend of the Mr. Grim Reaper. Kronos was one of those that people consider as the founder of the Greek Grim Reaper legend. Essentially how it goes, not to get into a lot of detail because it could take some time, Kronos was envious of his father's power, and a long story short, they had a little bit of conflict back and forth, so Kronos' mother gave Kronos a scythe and wanted Kronos to castrate his father because of all this conflict that was going on. So what essentially happened was he was ambushed. He used the scythe to castrate his father. He took power, and from the castration arose a couple more gods. Skipping towards the end, Kronos started to get afraid that his offspring would retaliate against him as he did his father. So he started to eat his offspring, and one by one, as he was having them, until he got to Zeus, where Zeus's mother would actually feed him a stone and go into hiding and allow Zeus to grow older. And after a point of time, Zeus used the scythe to basically cut open Kronos and retrieve his siblings from the stomach of Kronos. So that ties into the Grim Reaper approach to because Kronos is the god of the harvest. The scythe represents Kronos and how it was used to basically his demise and his death. So he's kind of looked at upon contributing factor to the Grim Reaper death stories. Now, expanding out past Greek legends, let's move into the Norse mythology. The Norse people had Odin, who would order his Valkyries to go to those who were in battle and have died in battle and escort their souls or essence to basically the Elysium fields. Some historians believe Odin could be the longest lost connection to the modern Grim Reaper. They believe that he was kind of the one who controlled the life or death essence from that long ago, using Valkyries as the psychopomps to bring the soldiers' souls to the Elysium fields, where they would dine in his hall for all eternity. So that's kind of the mythology in the Norse spectrum. If we go to the Breton, the Bretons believed that the Grim Reaper that they called Anku was a psychopomp as well, and they believed him to be dressed in a long black robe, riding a cart that carried the souls to the afterlife, and that was pulled by two horses. This is where the modern Grim Reaper gets sometimes the long black robe and the riding the horse aspect. This is kind of where those features come into play. And now you can kind of see where all these puzzle pieces are coming together from all the different mythologies of the past. Now in the Slavic mythology, the people had a little bit different conception of what death in the Grim Reaper style was. They viewed her as a woman, which is a little bit different than some of the past thoughts, because most of the time it's either a skeleton figure, a masculine energy, masculine person, not really female. So it kind of gives you a different perspective. And they put her in a white robe, not the black. And instead of actually removing the souls, they would just put the person into an everlasting sleep with a special sprout and herb. As peaceful as this sounds, people there had the infinite ability to make things weird. And it ended up turning this peaceful concept of the Grim Reaper into a skeleton during the Middle Ages. So that's how the Slavic mythology helps to add to the modern Grim Reaper thought process, is the skeleton aspect that was perverted into during the latter Middle Ages there, or excuse me, early Middle Ages. Now the Baltic and the Lithuanians, they always seen death to these folks. That's always been around them. And apparently they had an interesting depiction of them as well. As early accounts will describe the psychopomp as an ugly, wrinkled woman with a poisonous tongue and a long nose, kind of like the modern thought of how witches looked during the Inquisition and during Halloween nowadays. However, they will give in to this alluring looks, and later in history it will become a skeleton as well. So you start to see how people transcend from their original thoughts into the more modern approach, a more modern view of what the Grim Reaper looks like. Now, when you get over into the Asian Oriental, it's kind of interesting because the Hindus' Lord of Death, Yamaraja, who rides a black buffalo, and carries the souls to Yamlok, which is his abode. The Japanese, Yama or Enma, is the ruler of the underworld, and Shingami escorts them to basically escorts the dead to the afterlife. If I messed up the Hindu or Japanese name of how to pronounce those, by all means, please correct me because I would like to learn. So this brings us kind of up to the Middle Ages, where you get more depictions of what the Grim Reaper is, especially because of the Black Death, the bubonic plague. During the Black Death, the Grim Reaper got a lot more well known because people would actually report sightings of the Grim Reaper. As William Bromley would put in the book Gods of Eden, he describes how people were in Germany say there appeared 15 men with featureless faces and long scythes. They cut the oats down, but apparently the oats remained, and then shortly after the plague broke out in the cities of Brandenburg. In other European communities, they described men in black they called demons carrying brooms and scythes, and they would sweep the known doors of people who would soon after develop the plague there. So that's when you start to get the features of modern day Grim Reaper, and you start to actually get the Grim Reaper concept in modern times of the bringer of death, the one who chooses who dies, versus more of the psychopomp, oh, you died, let's get going up to this place we need to go. So that's kind of where it transitions into the modern, I'm going to touch you with my skeleton finger, and you are going to be dead. Now, backtrack it just a little bit to kind of give an overview of the Judaism, Catholicism, aspect with angelic forces. There has been numerous angelic names for the personification of death. Some even go to believe that Saint Michael is a personification of the Grim Reaper, as he is the lead warrior of the heavenly realms in the Christian faith. Now, that's opposed to how Samael is kind of the controversial angel of death, and when you get into more esoteric studies, you'd probably lean towards him more than you were Michael, as Michael would be more of a defender than a death bringer in that aspect. But when you get to Mexico and Catholicism in Mexico, you actually have a whole sect designated for the angel of death, Santa Muerte. And when you get into the studies of Santa Muerte, it's pretty in-depth and it's pretty interesting, and something that you don't want to mess with unless you are extremely devoted, because it is a very potent belief system. Now, there's also the Angel Azrael, who is the angel of death, and so essentially, from the Middle Ages to the modern time, we had a pretty good archetype of death as being black robes with a scythe, skeleton figure with a horse, without a horse. He touches you, you die type figure. And that has how it's been depicted in so many different paintings and so many different thought processes throughout the rest of the history until now, and even until today. And when you see the comic book strips, the shows with the Grim Reaper in it, that's the personification that we have put on them as a society, as a culture, as a whole. And one thing I'd like to point out that kind of struck me as odd and an interesting twist to the Grim Reaper legend um, came from a very popular show, Supernatural. When I was listening to this, I kind of saw the twist they put on it. Obviously, it's most likely based within the historical elements. It's not really 100% unique to the show, but they're the ones that put it out there for the public to see as an exposure type thing. But it really made it interesting because the way they described the death, he was a classy individual, an older man dressed in a suit and tux. He had the balance of the entire universe. He wasn't restricted to certain realms. He wasn't restricted to Earth or Uranus or Mars or certain energies and elements that gets depicted and personified on different esoteric deities and entities. He had the overwhelming power of the universe, of life and death, of who decides when and where they die. And the overall vastness of this just kind of blew me off because before then, I never really contemplated the vastness of death and how it expands and goes past the time, space process, where it's the overall factor of the universe. It is one of the most keyed variables in the equation of the universe is death itself and how it controls everything. And here's kind of a small clip from Supernatural.
So is this the part where you kill me?
You have an inflated sense of your importance. To a thing like me, a thing like you, well, think how you'd feel if a bacterium sat at your table and started to get snarky. This is one little planet, in one tiny solar system, in a galaxy that's barely out of its diapers. I'm old, Dean. Very old. So I invite you to contemplate how insignificant I find you.
Well, I gotta ask. How old are you?
As old as God? Maybe older. Neither of us can remember anymore. Life, death, chicken, egg. Regardless, at the end, I'll reap him too.
God? You'll reap God?
Oh, yes. God will die too, Dean.
Well, this is way above my pay grade.
Just a bit.
You can see in how that short clip, he kind of expresses his demeanor of what he is and his powerfulness and the age and even the philosophical question beyond God, but if there is a God, did God create death, and can death destroy God, in that interactive balance between the two? And that's what the new personification of death seems to be migrating to, is not so much this antiquated skeletal figure that is full of horror and fear, but more of an elegant entity, vibration, energy that is keeping the balance of life and maintaining the forces of the universe. Now, that's more of an esoteric approach outside this episode, but you can get the concept of how death is migrating away from this fearful imagery into a more acceptable form and life essence, if you would. Now that is what I got to wrap up today with on the short, brief history of death and the personification of death. And if you would, please leave your comments in the comment section. Let me know how you liked it. If you didn't, I will definitely work to improve the videos in the future. If you did, awesome, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. Subscribe below, as this is a newer channel, and I'd like to try to build up some new subscriptions. So thank you.